Hello, everybody. Today, what we're going to do for social studies is actually a pretty easy task. There is not going to be officially an assignment, but your assignment is to follow along with this video and go over the answers and go over the things that you kind of came up with the two Christian churches assignment. Okay, so obviously there's going to be multiple different answers, multiple different findings of what you kind of found from the readings. But we're really going to break it down by question, especially by these different colored chunks here, so that we can get to the bottom, which is all this stuff about these individuals. Okay. To start, we really want to just get into why the title is what it is and the business in yellow. We want to talk about what that is because you all obviously weren't in class to hear our discussion about this. But essentially, if you've been following along with this, we said that we're in that time period, kind of the end of what we should have covered in fifth grade. We're getting to the end of that very soon. And right now, again, it's still that time period where you have the end or the decline of the Roman Empire and you have kind of the increase of the influence of Christianity. Okay, so we're kind of in this overlapping time period. And you can see that here reflected in this yellow information. Okay, if you followed along already, you know that one of the problems with the Roman Empire, especially what led to the end of it, among many things, was the fact that they decided to split the entire empire into two halves because they figured let's have an eastern region and like a western region. We'll have a western and eastern emperor, so one for each side. We'll have a military that's on the west, a military that's on the east, because if a problem springs up on that side, then that side can deal with it. Now, naturally, we've been talking over the last couple of days how the Roman Empire and Christianity have kind of a weird relationship because early on, the Romans do not really care that much about Christians. They don't really pay them any mind. So they're not even really paying attention to them in the beginning. Later on, they realize they're becoming a bit of an influence, so the Roman Empire does not like Christians. They try to get rid of Christians, and eventually, like we mentioned, because of people like Constantine, they convert to Christianity. So we've said already that the Roman Empire goes from not really caring about Christians, really disliking the Christians, to becoming Christians themselves. And if you're looking at this yellow information, you'll see that that is also true because even when they split the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire, they will eventually become two other separate parts of even the Christian church. So you have the Western Roman Empire, which eventually becomes the Roman Catholic Church, which we still know of today. And you have the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire, that becomes the Eastern Orthodox Church, which still exists to this day. Okay, so if we jump down here to the first task, we're going to go through this pretty quick. I'm going to get my paper here figured out. Basically, it's saying list any similarities and differences between the Byzantine emperor of the day back then and like a pope right now. Now, if you started this assignment not really knowing much about the pope, that's okay. But from my chart, I did a chart myself, and on similarities, I came up with 3. If you came up with one good one, you're probably safe. And on differences, I came up with 3. Again, if you came up with one good one, you're probably safe. But let's talk about these real quick. My first similarity is actually the biggest similarity. Both the emperor of the time period, the Byzantine emperor, and the pope today are God's chosen representative. Okay, so they are supposed to be God's representative on earth. That's the biggest similarity. So if you didn't have that, I would add it. Okay, because the Byzantine emperor was supposed to be God's messenger or God's literal representation on earth to tell everybody the message of God. Similar today, the Pope does the same thing, right? The Pope is the leader of the Catholic Church, and he is supposed to be like the human, earthly representation of God's message to all of the rest of us. So that's their biggest job. A couple more similarities. One of them that the book mentions is that when they become leader, like when the emperor becomes emperor and the pope becomes the pope, there is a big ceremony. So there's like a crowning, which the pope doesn't wear a crown, but there's some sort of religious ceremony. That is still a similarity. Okay, they have subtle differences, but that's still similar. And another similarity is that they settle disputes about religious beliefs. Okay, so back in the day with the Byzantine emperor, and even still right now with the pope, if there's some kind of argument about the religion or about something going on in the Bible, then that person is supposed to represent or I guess interpret that information. Okay, So those are my three similarities. Differences now, little trickier, but some of the differences I caught, one of them is that back when the Byzantine emperor was in charge, he was more concerned about uniting his empire. Pope doesn't really try to unite an empire. He doesn't really lead a country specifically. He is just the leader of the Catholic faith. Okay, so the Pope himself is not really a government leader. The Byzantine emperor was. Okay, so uniting an empire is a difference that, they don't really match on that one. One difference that you might have caught on as far as the Pope even back then versus the Pope now is that they appointed all the church leaders. So if you think about that, the Pope, because Christianity is so big now in comparison, the Pope does not really appoint directly all of the church leaders. Obviously, Father Scott, who's in charge of a parish in Louisville, Kentucky, does not really have a direct appointment from somebody like the Pope in Rome. Okay, there are different channels that they have to go through. There's different levels that appointment goes through, but it's not the Pope directly picking that person for every single parish or every single archdiocese in all of the world. Okay, so that's one big difference, that the Pope doesn't necessarily pick all the church leaders directly these days. And the last one, which I consider to be the biggest one, is that the Pope back then kind of determined how people could worship. Okay. He determined or kind of set the rules on how people could worship or study the Christian faith. Today, that's not necessarily the same thing. Obviously, the Pope does not directly affect how you worship or choose to worship. He doesn't set different, rules or parameters like you have to pray this long or you have to study the Bible this many hours a day or anything like that. Okay, so the Pope determining how people worship is a big difference that I caught on to. So again, for similarities and differences, this one right here, if you have one good one and like one good similarity, one good difference, you would have been good to start. Okay, let's get into some of the easier ones down here. I'm going to move my face over here. I'll move this box out of the way and put it in the middle here. Okay, from 387, describing the big argument related to icons. This is pretty easy. Icons, as it mentions, are things like statues or paintings, murals that are supposed to represent religious figures. Okay, so a big statue of Jesus or a big picture of Mary, things like that, those are considered icons. The big argument is that the Eastern half thinks that is forbidden. They feel like idol worship, worshiping the idol, worshiping the big painting or worshiping the big statue is kind of breaking the rules. Okay. And there are some forms of Christianity and some forms of other religions that still believe that today. They feel like having a big statue of Jesus or having a big painting of Mary is kind of a misrepresentation. And their argument is because no one really knew exactly what Mary looked like or Jesus looked like. So it's kind of disrespectful to, represent them in that way if you don't really know what they look like. And also, some people are nervous that becomes the thing that people actually worship, like literally the statue itself. Okay, like they're going to be praying or bowing or whatever to the statue or the painting itself and not really be thinking about the religion, the teachings out of the Bible and things of that nature. Okay, so the argument with icons in this case is people feel like they become the focal point, right? Like it's forbidden, it should be forbidden. So that again is a beginning of a split already here between the churches. Describing what caused the Great Split or leading up to the Great Split, and I said you can include military events. Okay, there's several different answers here, friends, so you're going to have to hang on, but we want to get into the juicy details here because clearly there's a lot of reasons that these eventually would become two different parts. And Christianity is crazy like that even today, where it has a lot of different moving parts because you have Catholic and you have, Mormon and Lutheran and Methodist and Baptist and all these different kind of subsets. So there's a lot going on even just within Christianity. Okay. One of the major things that caused this split was church authority. They argued over how much influence the church really should have. Okay, and that's pretty straightforward, but some people thought the Pope was super important. Others thought that he was not. So who was actually in charge of Christianity was one of the big sticking points to begin. And speaking of that importance of the Pope, in one part of Christianity, they thought that the Pope was exactly what he says he was. a representative of God. But some of the other bishops in other parts of the church disagreed. They just thought that the Pope was kind of the group leader of all the other bishops, but that all the bishops' opinions mattered. Okay, so there's obviously some argument to that, whether you think the Pope is literally the representation of God, or like some bishops thought, he's just a guy, he's just kind of our speaker, our group leader, but all of us have a valued opinion. Okay, so they argued about that. One of the big sticking points, and again, I said here, you can include military events. At one point, Italy, which is where Rome is, which is where the Pope is attacked by some outside people, and the Pope asked the Byzantine Empire for help. So basically, if you look at the top here, the Western Roman Empire was getting attacked, and they asked the Byzantines, or they asked the Eastern half for help. And as you can assume, the Byzantine Emperor, the Eastern Roman Empire said no thanks. Okay, so it's one of those instances where the West was asking the East for some help in a military problem, and the East said no. So clearly that caused a rift between the two because they're asking for help. The one side says, nah, we're not going to get involved, and that causes a problem. Okay, that leads to one of these other answers. I don't know how deep you got into this, but because of the help that the Pope got, he actually crowned this other guy named Charlemagne, who in history is well known, but for our purposes, we're just going to keep it kind of low key. But Charlemagne was one of those people that actually did help the Pope in his time of need. So the Pope actually crowned Charlemagne as a king. Now, of course, the Eastern Roman Empire is not going to be happy about this because they already have their own emperor. They feel like there's enough leadership, there's enough kings flying around Europe at the time. So they're not happy about the Pope crowning Charlemagne, this other guy, as another king. Okay, so that caused a rift. And last but not least, the biggest one, I think, the biggest, I guess, input or the biggest cause that causes the split, biggest factor, I guess, is that the church and government issues in some people's minds should be combined, like in the case of the Pope, and in others they thought they should be separate. So what does that mean? In the Pope's case, he wanted to be in charge of not only the religion, but he wanted to be in charge of the government. So it's like you're the political leader and you're also the religious leader. Okay. In the Byzantine Empire, they did not want that. The emperor wanted to do his emperor things, and then all things related to religion were left up to religious leaders. So they had kind of a separation between what we today call church and state. Okay, it's basically religion and government. Okay, so that's the big one. The fact that they argued over should government and religion be combined or should government and religion be two separate things. Okay, so that knocks out this whole second blue question here. And these last ones are going to go pretty easy. Okay, these last ones are pretty easy because the word excommunicated just means that you are officially kicked out of the church. In some people's cases, they thought that was terrible. They thought it was a fate worse than death. Okay. In other people's cases, if you were going against the church or if you were doing something the church did not like, you might not have really cared if you got kicked out, honestly, right? So the word excommunicated just officially means you're kicked out. It also officially means by the religion standards that you can't get into heaven anymore. But again, if you're not really in line with what the church is doing anyway, you don't really care what the church says, you're probably not going to care much about getting excommunicated. Some people did, some people did not. All right, this other definition here, schism. A schism is just a fancy word for the split itself. It's the split between the two churches. Okay, so if we see this word schism, we already knew that this was going to happen because we said that there eventually is going to be two Christian churches, and we've described how we kind of got to that point this far. But when you hear the word schism officially, that is exactly the word split, just kind of in a fancy terminology. Okay, the last couple ones here are pretty easy. The purpose of monasteries and the purpose of convents, very similar. Okay, a monastery is a place for males. Okay, and what we today call monks, they go to a monastery to study religion. They study the Bible. They do good deeds, right? They do good works, and they lead pretty much a nice Christian living. Okay, they lead a clean life, healthy life. They help others. They study the religion. So that's the purpose of a monastery, for males to go and do those things. A convent is the female version of the same deal. Okay, so instead of monks going, now nuns are going, and it's pretty much the same thing. Studying the faith, good deeds, good Christian living, however you want to define that, but that's the purpose of these two. So a monastery is kind of the male version of that, and a convent is the female version of that. So monasteries is where monks live, convents are where nuns live. So they're basically the male and female version of the same idea. All right. These last three here, we'll knock these out real quick and you guys will be done listening to me for the day. We have Paula, Basil, and Benedict, and you just wanted to find their biggest contributions to the church or to the faith of Christianity. For Paula, her biggest work is that she helped translate the Bible into Latin. The earliest forms of Latin are written in Greek or some parts like Aramaic, which is kind of an older version of Arabic. It's kind of the language that Jesus would have spoke during his lifetime. But basically, she helps translate the Bible into Latin. So that's Paula's biggest accomplishment. Basil sets out a bunch of rules, a bunch of kind of a structure of rules for both monks and nuns, so that monks across the religion of Christianity would all be doing or focusing on the same thing, and nuns across Christianity would be doing and focusing on the same thing. So Basil just kind of sets up the rules for monks and nuns. And then this last person, Benedict, Benedict kind of goes one further than Basil. Okay, so he's going to set even more rules. And I'm going to give you guys what the rules are, and you can kind of jot them down in your own way. But he sets out that people should live a life of poverty. So that means if you're going to become a monk or a nun, you need to give up worldly possessions. So you basically have to live an impoverished life. So live in poverty and not have all kinds of fancy things and have a bunch of money saved up. You're basically just supposed to give all those things up. So life of poverty, doing good works. Okay, so that's literal doing work, like doing labor, like helping if it's building a church or helping clean an area, things like that. But actual good works, so helping the poor, helping the less fortunate. Prayer, he sets kind of the rules or the structure of what's expected as far as prayer. And he also adds things like missionaries or people going on mission trips. And you all that know anything about mission trips, you go on a mission trip to do something good, right? You go help out at a school, you go help build a church like in a different country or a different area of your own country. But you're also in doing that showing Christianity in a good light. So by doing a mission trip or by going on a mission trip, you're also showing others the positive side of Christianity. Okay, so poverty, good works, prayer, and missions or missionaries is the last part here for Benedict. Okay, so like I said, there is no official assignment that needs to be turned in today, but this was a lot. Okay, and I'm hoping that you all have gone back and added what needed to be added. Okay, if you had it on notebook paper, or if you had it on some kind of digital format, you can definitely go add things that we said. Okay, if you were missing any, if you missed a question somewhere and totally skipped it, definitely go back and add the information that we just talked about. But again, you guys are off the hook with me for today just by listening to this thing and going over what you had. And we're going to be wrapping up our conversation here in the next couple days about this whole overlap of Romans and early Christianity. And then we're finally going to get caught up to where we would have started sixth grade year, and we'll be right back on track. All right. As always, I hope you all are staying safe. Be well out there, and I'll talk to you very soon. All right. See ya.